evening. Hope we're all alright tonight on this lovely Thursday, April 1st. I will not be doing a prank. I will just be going back to our normal reading. I hope you're having a fun and safe holiday if you're celebrating it all. But yeah, we'll just be continuing on our journey through this 1950s science fiction novel. So, continuing from chapter 8, Headaches. They lifted from Sargol on schedule and went into Hyper also on schedule. From that point on, there was nothing to do but wait out the usual dull time of flight between systems and hope that Steen Wilcox had plotted a course which would cut that flight time to a minimum. But this voyage, there was little relaxation once they were in Hyper. No matter when Dane dropped into the mess cabin, which was the common meeting place of the spacer, he was apt to find others there before him, usually with a mug of one of Mura's special brews close at hand, speculating about their landing date. Dane himself, once he had thrown off the lingering effects of his Sargolian illness, applied time to his studies. When he had first joined the Queen as a recruit straight out of the training pool, he had speedily learned that all the 10 years of intensive study then behind him had only been an introduction to the amount he still had to absorb before he could take his place as an equal with such a traitor as Venrika. If he had the stuff which would raise him in time to that exalted level. While he had still had his superior's favors, he had dared to treat him as an instructor, going to him with perplexing problems of stowage or barter. But now he had no desire to intrude upon the cargo master and doggedly wrestled with the microtapes of old records on his own, painfully working out the why and wherefore for any departure from the regular procedure. He had no inkling of his own future status, whether the return to Terra would find him permanently earthed, and he would ask no questions. They had been 4 days of ship's time in Hyper when Dane walked into the mess cabin, tired after his work with old records, to discover no Mora busy in the galley beyond, no brew steaming on the heat coil. Rip sat at the table, his long legs stuck out, his usually happy face very sober. "What's wrong?" Dane reached for a mug, then seeing no pot of drink, put it back in place. "Frank's sick." "What?" Dane turned. Illness such as they had run into on Sargol had a logical base, but illness on board ship was something else. "Tau has him isolated. He had a bad headache, and he blacked out when he tried to sit up. Tau's running tests." Dane sat down. "Could be something he ate." Rip shook his head. "He wasn't at the feast, remember? And he didn't eat anything from outside. He swore that to Tau. In fact, he didn't go dirt much while we were down." That was only too true, as Dane could now recall, and the fact that the steward had not been at the feast, had not sampled native food products, wiped out the simplest and most comforting reasons for his present collapse. "What's this about Frank?" Ali stood in the doorway. "He said yesterday that he had a headache, but now Tau has him shut off. But he wasn't at the feast." Ali stopped short as the implication struck him. "How's Tang feeling?" "Fine. Why?" The Comtech had come up behind Camille and was answering for himself. "Why this interest in the state of my health?" "Frank's down with something. In isolation," Rip replied bluntly. "Did he do anything out of the ordinary when we were off ship?" For a long moment the other stared at Shannon, and then he shook his head. "No, and he wasn't dirtside to any extent either, so Tau's running tests." He lapsed into silence. None of them wished to put their thoughts into words. Dane picked up the microtape he had brought with him and went on down the corridor to return it. The panel of the cargo office was ajar, and to his relief he found Venrika out. He shoved the tape back in its case and pulled out the next one. Sinbad was there, not in his own private hammock, but sprawled out on the cargo master's bunk. He watched Dane lazily, mouthing a silent mew of welcome. For some reason, since they had blasted from Sargol, the cat had been lazy, as if his adventures afield had sapped much of his vitality. "Why aren't you out there working?" Dane asked as he leaned over to scratch under a furry chin raised for a benefit of such caress. You inspect the hold lately, boy? Sinbad merely blinked, and after the manner of his species looked infinitely bored. As Dane turned to go, the cargo master came in. He showed no surprise at Dane's presence. Instead, he reached out and fingered the label of the tape Dane had just chosen. After a glance at the identifying symbol, he took it out of his assistant's hand, plopped it back in its case, and stood for a moment eyeing the selection of past voyage records. With a tongue click of satisfaction, he pulled out another and tossed it across the desk to Dane. "See what you can make of this tangle," he ordered. But Dane's shoulders went back as if some weight had been lifted from them. The old easiness was still lacking, but he was no longer exiled to the outer darkness of Van Rieke's displeasure. Holding the microtape as if it were a first-grade Koros stone, Dan went back to his own cabin, snapped the tape into his reader, adjusted the ear buttons, and lay back on his bunk to listen. He was deep in the intricacy of a deal so complicated that he was lost after the first two moves when he opened his eyes to see Ali at the door panel. The engineer apprentice made an emphatic, beckoning wave, and Dane slipped off the ear buttons. "What is it?" His question lacked a cordial note. "I've got to have help." Ali was terse. "Costy's blacked out." "What?" Dane sat up and dropped his feet to the deck in almost one movement. "I can't shift him alone," Ali stated the obvious. The giant jet man was almost double his size. "We must get him to his quarters, and I won't ask Stotts," for a perfectly good reason Dane knew. An assistant, 2 of the apprentices could go sick, but their officers' continued good health meant the most to the Queen. If some infection were aboard, it would be better for Ali and himself to be exposed than to have Johann Stotts, with all his encyclopedic knowledge of the ship's engines, contract any disease. They found the jetman half sitting, half lying, in the short foot or so of corridor which led to his own cubby. He had been making for his quarters when the seizure had taken him, and by the time the two reached his side, he was beginning to come round, moaning, his hands going to his head. Together they got him on his feet and guided him to his bunk, where he collapsed again, dead weight they had to push into place. Dane looked at Ali. "Tao?" "Haven't had time to call him yet." Ali was jerking at the thigh straps which fastened Costy's space boots. "I'll go." Glad for the task, Dane sped up the ladder to the next section and threaded the narrow side hall to the medic's cabin, where he knocked on the panel. There was a pause before Craig Tao looked out, deep lines of weariness bracketing his mouth etched between his eyes. "Costy, sir." Dane gave his bad news quickly. "He's collapsed. We got him to his cabin." Tao showed no signs of surprise. His hand shot out for his kit. "You touched him." At the other's nod, he added an order. "Stay in your quarters until I have a chance to look you over, understand?" Dane had no chance to answer. The medic was already on his way. He went to his own cabin, understanding the reason for his imprisonment, but inwardly rebelling against it. Rather than sit idle, he snapped on the reader, but although facts and figures were dunned into his ears, he really heard very little. He couldn't apply himself, not with a new specter leering at him from the bulkhead. The dangers of the space lanes were not to be numbered. Death walked among the stars, a familiar companion of all spacemen, and to the free trader it was the extra and invisible crewman on every ship that raised. But there were deaths, and Dane could not forget the gruesome legends Van Rieke, collected avidly as his hobby, had recorded in his private library of the folklore of space. Stories such as that of the ghastly New Hope, carrying refugees from the first Martian rebellion, the ship which had lifted for the stars but had never arrived, which wandered for a timeless eternity, a derelict in free fall, its port closed but the warning dead lights on at its nose. A ship which through 5 centuries had been sighted only by a spacer in similar distress. Such stories were numerous. There were the other tales of plague ships, wandering free with their dead crews, or discovered and shot into some sun by a patrol cruiser so that they might not carry their infection farther. Plague. The nebulous worst the traders had to face. Dane screwed his eyes shut, tried to concentrate upon the droning voice in his ears, but he could not control his thoughts nor his fears. At a touch on his arm, he started so wildly that he jerked the cord loose from the reader and sat up, somewhat shamefaced, to greet Tao. At the medic's orders, he stripped for one of the most complete examinations he had ever undergone outside a quarantine port. It included an almost microscopic inspection of the skin on his neck and shoulders, but when Tao had done, he gave a sigh of relief. "Well, you haven't got it. At least you don't show any signs yet." He amended his first statement almost before the words were out of his mouth. "What were you looking for?" Tao took time out to explain. "Here." His fingers touched the small hollow at the base of Dane's throat, and then swung him around and indicated 2 places on the back of his neck and under his shoulder blades. "Costi and Murrah both have red eruptions here. It's as if they've been given an injection of some narcotic." Tao sat down on the jump seat while Dane dressed. "Costi was dirtside. He might have picked up something, but Murrah, that's it." Tao brought his fist down on the edge of the bunk. "Frank hardly left the ship, yet he showed the first signs. On the other hand, you're all right so far, and you were off ship. And Ali's clean, and he was with you on the hunt. We'll just have to wait and see." He got up wearily. "If your head begins to ache," he told Dane, "you get back here in a hurry and stay put, understand?" As Dane learned, all the other members of the crew were given the same type of inspection, but none of them showed the characteristic marks which meant trouble. They were on course for Terra, and that but must have loomed large in all their minds. Once there, would they be allowed to land? Could they even hope for a hearing? Plague ship. Tau must find the answer before they came into normal space about their own solar system, or they were in for such trouble as made a broken contract seem the simplest of mishaps. Costi and Murrah were in isolation. There were volunteers for nursing, and Tau, unable to be in 2 places at once, finally picked weeks to look after his crewmate in the engineering section. There was doubling up of duties. Tau could no longer share with Murrah the care of the Hydra Garden, so Van Rieke took over. While Dane found himself in charge of the galley, and while he did not have Murrah's deft hand at disguising the monotonous concentrates to the point they resembled fresh food, after a day or 2 he began to experiment cautiously and produced a stew which brought some short words of appreciation from Captain Jellicoe. They all breathed a sigh of relief when, after 3 days, no more signs of the mysterious illness showed on new members of the crew. It became routine to parade before Tau, stripped to the waist, each morning for the inspection of the danger points, and the medic's vigilance did not relax. In the meantime, neither Murrah nor Costi appeared to suffer. Once the initial stages of headaches and blackouts were past, the patients lapsed into a semi-conscious state as if they were under sedation of some type. They would eat if the food was placed in their mouths, but they did not seem to know what was going on about them, nor did they answer when spoken to. Tau, between visits to them, worked feverishly in his tiny lab, analyzing blood samples, reading the records of obscure diseases, trying to find the reason for their attacks, but as yet his discoveries were exactly nothing. He had come out of his quarters and sat in limp exhaustion at the mess table while Dane placed before him a mug of stimulating calf-hag. "I don't get it," the medic addressed the tabletop rather than the amateur cook. "It's a poison of some kind. Costi went dirtside, Murrah didn't, yet Murrah came down with it first, and we didn't ship any food from Sargol, neither did he eat any while we were there. Unless he did and we didn't know about it. If I could just bring him to long enough to answer a couple of questions." Sighing, he dropped his weary head on his folded arms, and within seconds was asleep. Dane put the mug back on the heating unit and sat down at the other end of the table. He did not have the heart to shake Tau into wakefulness. Let the poor devil get a slice of bunk time. He certainly needed it after the fatigues of the past 4 days. Van Rieke passed along the corridor on his way to the hydro, Sinbad at his heels, but in a moment the cat was back, leaping up on Dane's knee. He did not curl up, but rubbed against the young man's arm, finally reaching up with a paw to touch Dane's chin, uttering one of the soundless mews which were his bid for attention. "What's the matter, boy?" Dane fondled the cat's ears. "You haven't got a headache, have you?" In that second, a wild surmise came into his mind. Sinbad had been planet-side on Sargol as much as he could, and on shipboard he was equally at home in all their cabins. Could he be the carrier of the disease? A good idea. Only if it were true, then logically the second victim should have been Van or Dane, whereas Sinbad lingered most of the time in their cabins, not Costi. The cat, as far as he knew, had never shown any particular fondness for the jetman, and certainly did not sleep in Carl's quarters. No, that point did not fit. But he would mention it to Tao, no use overlooking anything, no matter how wild. It was the sequence of victims which puzzled them all. As far as Tao had been able to discover, Mura and Costi had nothing much in common except that they were crewmates on the same spacer. They didn't bunk in the same section, their fields of labor were totally different, they had no special food or drink tastes in common, they weren't even the same race. Frank Mura was one of the few descendants of a mysterious, or now mysterious, people who had had their home on a series of islands in one of Terra's seas, islands which almost 100 years before had been swallowed up in a series of world-ending quakes. Japan was the ancient name of that nation. While Carl Costi had come from the once thickly populated landmasses half the planet away, which had borne the geographical name of Europe, no, all the way along the two victims had only the very general meeting points. They both shipped on the Solar Queen, and they were both of Terran birth. Tao stirred and sat up, blinking bemusedly at Dane, then pushed back his wiry black hair and assumed a measure of alertness. Dane dropped the now purring cat in the medic's lap, and in a few sentences outlined his suspicion. Tao's hands closed about Sinbad. "There's a chance in that." He looked a little less beat, and he drank thirstily from the mug Dane gave him for the second time. Then he hurried out with Sinbad under one arm, bound for his lab. Dane slicked up the galley, trying to put things away as neatly as Mura kept them. He didn't have much faith in the Sinbad lead, but in this case everything must be checked out. When the medic did not appear during the rest of the ship's day, Dane was not greatly concerned, but he was alerted to trouble when Ali came in with an inquiry and a complaint. "Seen anything of Craig?" "He's in the lab," Dane answered. "He didn't answer my knock," Ali protested, "and Weeks says he hasn't been in to see Carl all day." That did catch Dane's attention. Had his half-hunch been right? Was Tao on the trail of a discovery which had kept him chained to the lab? But it wasn't like the medic not to look in on his patients. "You're sure he isn't in the lab?" "I told you that he didn't answer my knock. I didn't open the panel," but now Ali was already in the corridor, heading back the way he had come, with Dane on his heels, an unwelcome explanation for that silence in both their minds. And their fears were reinforced by what they heard as they approached the panel. A low moan wrung out of unbearable pain. Dane thrust the sliding door open. Tao had slipped from his stool to the floor. His hands were at his head, which rolled from side to side as if he were trying to quiet some agony. Dane stripped down the medic's undertunic. There was no need to make a careful examination. In the hollow of Craig Tao's throat was the telltale red blotch. "Sinbad!" Dane glanced about the cabin. "Did Sinbad get out past you?" he demanded of the puzzled Ali. "No, I haven't seen him all day." Yet the cat was nowhere in the tiny cabin, and it had no concealed hiding place. To make doubly sure, Dane secured the panel before they carried Tao to his bunk. The medic had blacked out again, passed into the lethargic second stage of the malady. At least he was out of the pain which appeared to be the worst symptom of the disease. "It must be Sinbad," Dane said as he made his report directly to Captain Jellicoe. "And yet—" "Yes. He's been staying in Van's cabin," the captain mused. "And you've handled him. He slept on your bunk, yet you and Van are all right. I don't understand that. Anyway, to be on the safe side, we'd better find and isolate him before—" He didn't have to underline any words for the grim-faced men who listened. With Tao, their one hope of fighting the disease gone, they had a black future facing them. They did not have to search for Sinbad. Dane, coming down to his own section, found the cat crouched before the panel of Van Rieke's cabin, his eyes glued to the thin crack of the door. Dane scooped him up and took him to the small cargo space intended for the safeguarding of choice items of commerce. To his vast surprise, Sinbad began fighting wildly as he opened the hatch, kicking and then slashing with ready claws. The cat seemed to go mad, and Dane had all he could do to shut him in. When he snapped the panel, he heard Sinbad launch himself against the barrier as if to batter his way out. Dane, blood welling in several deep scratches, went in search of first aid, but some suspicion led him to pause as he passed Van Rieke's door, and when his knock brought no answer, he pushed the panel open. Van Rieke lay on his bunk, his eyes half closed in a way which had become only too familiar to the crew of the Solar Queen, and Dane knew that when he looked for it he would find the mark of the strange plague on the cargo master's body. Chapter 9. Plague! Exclamation point. Jellicoe and Steen Wilcox pored over the few notes Tao had made before he was stricken, but apparently the medic had found nothing to indicate that Sinbad was the carrier of any disease. Meanwhile, the captain gave orders for the cat to be confined, a difficult task since Sinbad crouched close to the door of the storage cabin and was ready to dart out when food was taken in for him. Once he got a good way down the corridor before Dane was able to corner and return him to keeping. Dane, Ali, and Weeks took on the full care of the 4 sick men, leaving the few regular duties of the ship to the senior officers, while Rip was installed in charge of the hydro garden. Murrah, the first to be taken ill, showed no change. He was semi-conscious, he swallowed food if it were put in his mouth, he responded to nothing around him, and Costi, Tao, and Van Rieke followed the same pattern. They still held morning inspection of those on their feet for signs of a new outbreak, but when no one else went down during the next 2 days, they regained a faint spark of hope. Hope which was snapped out when Ali brought the news that Stotts could not be roused, and must have taken ill during a sleep period. One more inert patient was added to the list, and nothing learned about how he was infected, except that they could eliminate Sinbad since the cat had been in custody during the time Stotts had apparently contracted the disease. Weeks, Ali, and Dane, though they were in constant contact with the sick men, and though Dane had repeatedly handled Sinbad, continued to be immune. A fact, Dane thought more than once, which must have significance. If someone with Tao's medical knowledge had been able to study it. By all rights, they should be the most susceptible, but the opposite seemed true, and Wilcox duly noted that fact among the data they had recorded. It became a matter of watching each other, waiting for another collapse, and they were not surprised when Tang Ya reeled into the mess, his face livid and drawn with pain. Rip and Dane got him to his cabin before he blacked out, but all they could learn from him during the interval before he lost consciousness was that his head was bursting and he couldn't stand it. Over his limp body they stared at one another bleakly. 6 down, Ali observed, and 6 to go. How do you feel? Tired, that's all. What I don't understand is that once they go into this stupor, they just stay. They don't get any worse, they have no rise in temperature. It's as if they're in a modified form of cold sleep. How's Tang? Rip asked from the corridor. Usual pattern, Ali answered. He's sleeping. Got a pain, fella? Rip shook his head. Right as a comm unit. I don't get it. Why does it strike Tang, who didn't even hit dirt much, and yet you keep on... Dane grimaced. If we had an answer to that, maybe we'd know what caused the whole thing. Ali's eyes narrowed. He was staring straight at the unconscious comm tech, as if he did not see that supine body at all. I wonder if we've been salted, he said slowly. We've been what? Dane demanded. Look here, we 3, with Weeks, drank that brew of the Salariki, didn't we? And we were as sick as Venusian gobblers afterwards, agreed Rip. Light dawned. Do you mean, began Dane. So that's it? It might just be, Ali said. Do you remember how the settlers on Cambeline brought their Terran cattle through the first year? They fed them salt mixed with fancel grass. The result was that the herds didn't take the fancel grass fever when they turned them out to pasture in the dry season. All right, maybe we had our salt in that drink. The fancel salt makes the cattle filthy sick when it's forced down their throat, but after they recover, they're immune to the fever, and nobody on Cambeline buys unsalted cattle now. That sounds logical, admitted Rip, but how are we going to prove it? Ali's face was black once more. Probably by elimination, he said morosely. If we keep our feet and all the rest go down, that's our proof. But we ought to be able to do something, protested Shannon. Just how? Ali's slender brows arched. Do you have a gallon of that Salariki brew on board you can serve out? We don't know what was in it, nor are we sure that this whole idea has any value. All of them had had first aid and basic preventive medicine as part of their training, but the more advanced laboratory experimentation was beyond their knowledge and skill. Had Tau still been on his feet, perhaps he could have traced that lead and brought order out of the chaos which was closing in upon the Solar Queen, but though they reported their suggestion to the captain, Jellicoe was powerless to do anything about it. If the four who had shared that upsetting friendship cup were immune to the doom which now overhung the ship, there was no possible way for them to discover why or how. Ship's time came to have little meaning, and they were not surprised when Steen Wilcox slipped from his seat before the computer to be stowed away with what had become a familiar procedure. Only Jellicoe withstood the contagion apart from the younger four, taking his turn at caring for the helpless men. There was no change in their condition. They neither roused nor grew worse as the hours and then the days sped by, but each of those units of time in passing brought them nearer to greater danger. Sooner or later they must make the transition out of hyper into system space, and the jump out of warp was something not even a veteran took lightly. Rip's round face thinned while they watched. Jellicoe was still functioning, but if the captain collapsed, the whole responsibility for the snap-out would fall directly on Shannon. An infinitesimal error would condemn them to almost hopeless wandering, perhaps forever. Dane and Ali relieved Rip of all duty but that which kept him chained in Wilcox's chair before the computers. He went over and over the data of the course the astrogator had set, and Captain Jellicoe, his eyes sunk in dark pits, checked and rechecked. When the fatal moment came, Ali manned the engine room with Weeks at his elbow to tend the controls the acting engineer could not reach, and Dane, having seen the sick all safely stowed in crash webbing, came up to the control cabin, riding out the transfer in Tang Ya's place. Rip's voice hoarsened into a croak, calling out the data. Dane, though he had had basic theory, was completely lost before Shannon had finished the first set of coordinates, but Jellicoe replied, hands playing across the pilot's board. "Stand by for snap-out." The croak went down to the engines where Ali now held Stott's post. "Engines ready," the voice came back, thinned by its journey from the Queen's interior. "Aught, 5, 9, that was Jellicoe. Dane found himself suddenly unable to watch. He shut his eyes and braced himself against the vertigo of snap-out. It came, and he whirled sickeningly through unstable space. Then he was sitting in the laced Comtech seat looking at Rip. Runnels of sweat streaked down Shannon's brown face. There was a damp patch darkening his tunic between his shoulder blades, a patch which it would take both of Dane's hands to cover. For a moment, he did not raise his head to look at the vision plate which would tell him whether or not they had made it. But when he did, familiar constellations made the patterns they knew. They were out, and they couldn't be too far off the course Wilcox had plotted. There was still the system run to make, but snap-out was behind them. Rip gave a deep sigh and buried his head in his hands. With a throb of fear, Dane unhooked his safety belt and hurried over to him. When he clutched at Shannon's shoulder, the astrogator apprentice's head rolled limply. Was Rip down with the illness too? But the other muttered and opened his eyes. "Does your head ache?" Dane shook him. "Head? No." Rip's words came drowsily. "Just sleepy. So sleepy." He did not seem to be in pain, but Dane's hands were shaking as he hoisted the other out of his seat and half carried, half led him to his cabin, praying as he went that it was only fatigue and not the disease. The ship was on auto now until Jellicoe, his pilot, set a course. Dane got Rip down in the bunk and stripped off his tunic. The fine, drawn face of the sleeper looked wan against the foam rest, and he snuggled into the softness like a child as he turned over and curled up. But his skin was clear. It was real sleep and not the plague which had claimed him. Impulse sent Dane back to the control cabin. He was not an experienced pilot officer, but there might be some assistance he could offer the captain now that Rip had washed out, perhaps for hours. Jellicoe hunched before the smaller computer, feeding pilot tape into its slot. His face was a skull under a thin coating of skin, the bones marking it sharply at jaw, nose, and eye socket. "Shannon down?" His voice was a mere whisper of its powerful self. He did not turn his head. "He's just worn out, sir," Dane hastened to give reassurance. "The marks aren't on him." "When he comes around to tell him the coords are in," Jellicoe murmured. "See he checks course in 10 hours. "But, sir," Dane's protest failed as he watched the captain struggle to his feet, pulling himself up with shaking hands. As Thorson reached forward to steady the other, one of those hands tore at tunic collar, ripping loose the ceiling. There was no need for explanation. The red splotch signaled from Jellicoe's sweating throat. He kept his feet, holding out against waves of pain by sheer willpower. Then Dane had a grip on him, got him away from the computer, hoping he could keep him going until they reached Jellicoe's cabin. Somehow they made that journey, being greeted with raucous screams from the Hoobat. Furiously, Dane slapped the cage, setting it to swinging, and so silencing the creature which stared at him with round, malignant eyes as he got the captain into bed. Only 4 of them on their feet now, Dane thought bleakly, as he left the cabin. If Rip came out of it in time, they could land. Dane's breath caught as he made himself face up to the fact that Shannon might be ill, that it might be up to him to bring the Queen in for a landing. And in where? The Terra quarantine was Luna City on the moon, but let them signal for a set down there, let them describe what had happened, and they might face death as a plague ship. Wearily he climbed down to the mess cabin to discover Weeks and Ali there before him. They did not look up as he entered. "Old man's got it," he reported. "Rip?" was Ali's crossing question. "Asleep. He passed out." "What?" Weeks swung round. "Worn out," Dane amended. "Captain fed in a pilot tape before he gave up." "So now we are 3, was Ali's comment. "Where do we set down? Luna City?" "If they let us," Dane hinted at the worst. "But they've got to let us," Weeks exclaimed. "We can't just wander around out here." "It's been done," Ali reminded them brutally, and that silenced Weeks. "Did the old man set Luna?" After a long pause, Ali inquired. "I didn't check," Dane confessed. "He was giving out, and I had to get him to his bunk." It might be well to know. The engineer apprentice got up, his movements lacking much of the elastic spring which was normally his. When he climbed to control, both the others followed him. Ali's slender fingers played across a set of keys, and in the small screen mounting on the computer a set of figures appeared. Dane took up the master course book, read the connotation, and blinked. "Not Luna?" Ali asked. "No, but I don't understand. This must be for somewhere in the asteroid belt." Ali's lips stretched into a pale caricature of a smile. "Good for the old man. He still had his wits about him even after the bug bit him." "But why are we going to the asteroids?" Weeks asked reasonably enough. "There are medics at Luna City. They can help us." "They can handle known diseases," Ali pointed out. "But what of the code?" Weeks dropped into the Comtech's place as if some of the stiffening had vanished from his thin but sturdy legs. "They wouldn't do that," he protested, but his eyes said that he knew that they might. They well might. "Oh, no?" "Face the facts, man." Ali sounded almost savage. "We come from a frontier planet where a plague ship—" He did not have to underline that. They all knew too well the danger in which they now stood. "Nobody's died yet." Weeks tried to find an opening in the net being drawn about them. "And nobody's recovered." Ali crushed that thread of hope. "We don't know what it is, how it is contracted, anything about it. Let us make a report saying that, and you know what will happen, don't you?" They weren't sure of the details, but they could guess. "So I say," Ali continued, "the old man was right when he set us on an evasion course. If we can stay out until we really know what is the matter, we'll have some chance of talking over the high brass at Luna when we do planet." In the end, they decided not to interfere with the course the captain had set. It would take them into the fringes of solar civilization, but give them a fighting chance at solving their problems before they had to report to the authorities. In the meantime, they tended their charges, let Rip sleep, and watched each other with desperate but hidden intentness, ready for another to be stricken. However, they remained, although almost stupid with fatigue at times, reasonably healthy. Time was proving that their guess had been correct. They had been somehow inoculated against the germ or virus which had struck the ship. Rip slept for 24 hours ship time and then came into the mess cabin ravenously hungry to catch up on both food and news. And he refused to join with the prevailing pessimistic view of the future. Instead, he was sure that their own immunity having been proven, they had a talking point to use with the medical officials at Luna, and he was eager to alter course directly for the quarantine station. Only the combined arguments of the other three made him unwillingly agree to a short delay. And how grateful they should be for Captain Jellicoe's foresight they learned within the next day. Ali was at the comm unit trying to pick up Solarian news reports. When the red alert flashed on throughout the ship, it brought the others hurrying to the control cabin. The code squeaks were magnified as Ali switched on the receiver full strength to be translated as he pressed a second button. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Free Trader, Solar Queen, Terra Registry 657249110JK, suspected plague ship, took off from infected planet. Warn off, report such ship to Luna Station, Solar Queen from infected planet, to be warned off and reported. The same message was repeated 3 times before going off ether. The 4 in the control cabin looked at each other blankly. But Dane broke the silence. How did they know? We haven't reported in. The Ices. Ali had the answer ready. That IS ship must be having the same sort of trouble and reported to her company. They would include us in their report and believe that we were infected too, or it would be easy to convince the authorities that we were. I wonder. Rip's eyes were narrowed slits as he leaned back against the wall. Look at the facts. The survey ship which charted Sargol, they were dirtside there about 3 to 4 months. Yet they gave it a clean bill of health and put it up for trading rights auction. Then Cam bought those rights. He made at least 2 trips in and out before he was blasted on Limbo. No infection bothered him or Survey. But you've got to admit it hit us, Weeks protested. Yes, and the icy ship was able to foresee it, report us before we snapped out of hyper. Sounds almost as if they expected us to carry plague, doesn't it? Shannon wanted to know. Planted? Ali frowned at the banks of controls. But how? No Icy came on board, no Salaric either, except for the cub who showed us what they thought of catnip. Rip shrugged. How would I know how they did? He was beginning when Dane cut in. If they didn't know about our immunity, the Queen might stay in hyper and never come out. There wouldn't be anyone to set the snap out. Right enough, but on the chance that somebody did keep on his feet and bring her home, they were ready with a cover. If no one raises a howl, Sargol will be written off the charts as infected. IS sits on her tail fins a year or so, and then she promotes an investigation before the board. The survey records are trotted out, no infection recorded, so they send in a patrol probe. Everything's all right, so it wasn't the planet after all. It was that dirty old free trader, and she's out of the way. IS gets the Koros trade all square and legal, and we're no longer around to worry about. Neat as a Salariki netcast, and right around our collective throats, my friends. So, what do we do now? Weeks wanted to know. We keep on the old man's course, get lost in the asteroids until we can do some heavy thinking and see a way out, but if IS gave us this prize package, some trace of its origin is still aboard, and if we can find that, why, then we have something to start from. Murrah went down first, and then Carl, nothing in common. The old problem faced Dane for the 100th time. No, but Ali arose from his place at the comm unit. I'd suggest a real search of first Frank's and then Carl's quarters. A regular turnout down to the bare walls of their cabins. Are you with me? Fly, boy, we're ahead of you, Rip contributed, already at the door panel. Down to the bare walls it is. Chapter 10. Estat Landing. Since Murrah was in the isolation of ship sick bay, the stripping of his cabin was a relatively simple job, but though Rip and Dane went over it literally by inches, they found nothing unusual. In fact, nothing from Sargol except a small twig of the red wood which lay on the steward's work table, where he had been fashioning something to incorporate in one of his miniature fairy landscapes, to be imprisoned for all time in a plastibubble. Dane turned this around in his fingers. Because it was the only link with the perfume planet, he couldn't help but feel that it had some importance. Vacosti had not shown any interest in the wood, and he himself and Weeks had handled it freely before they had tasted Graf's friendship cup and had no ill effects, so it couldn't be the wood. Dane put the twig back on the work table and snapped the protecting cover over the delicate tools, never realizing until days later how very close he had been in that moment to the solution of their problem. After 2 hours of shifting every one of the steward's belongings, of crawling on hands and knees about the deck and climbing to inspect perfectly bare walls, they had found exactly nothing. Rip sat down on the end of the denuded bunk. "There's the hydro. Frank spent a lot of time in there, and the storeroom," he told the places off on his fingers. "The galley and the mess cabin." Those had been the extent of Mora's world. They could search the storeroom, the galley, and the mess cabin, but to interfere with the hydro would endanger their air supply. It was for that very reason that they now looked at each other in startled surmise. "The perfect place to plant something." Dane spoke first. Rip's teeth caught his underlip. The hydro. Something planted there could not be routed out unless they made a landing on a port field and had the whole section stripped. "Devilish." Rip's mobile lips drew tight. "But how could they do it?" Dane didn't see how it could have been done either. No one but the Queen's own crew had been on board the ship during their entire stay on Sargol, except for the young Salaric. Could that cub have brought something? But he and Mora had been with the youngster every minute that he had been in the hydro. To the best of Dane's memory, the cub had touched nothing and had been there only for a few moments. That had been before the feast also. Rip got to his feet. "We can't strip the hydro in space," he pointed out the obvious quietly. Dane had the answer. "Then we've got our Earth." "You heard that, Warnoff. If we try it, what about an emergency station?" Rip stood very still, his big hands locked about the buckle of his arms belt. Then, without another word, he went out of the cabin at a pounding pace up the ladder, bound for the captain's cabin and the records Jellicoe kept there. It was such a slim chance, but it was better than none at all. Dane shouldered into the small space in his wake to find Rip making a selection from the astrogation tapes. There were E-stats among the asteroids. Points prospectors or small traders in sudden difficulties might contact for supplies or repairs. The big companies maintained their own. The patrol had several for independence. "No patrol, Juan?" Rip managed a smile. "I haven't gone space whirly yet," was his comment. He was feeding a tape into the reader on the captain's desk. In the cage over his head, the blue Hoobat squatted, watching him intently, for the first time since Dane could remember, showing no sign of resentment by weird screams or wild spitting. "Patrol stat 854, the reader squeaked. Rip hit a key and the wire clicked to the next entry. "Combine E-stat," another punch and click. "Patrol E-stat A55, punch click. "Intersolar," this time Rip's hand did not hit the key and the squeak continued. "Coordinates." Rip reached for a stilo and jotted down the list of figures. "Got to compare this with our present course." "But that's an IS stat," began Dane, and then he laughed as the justice of such a move struck him. They did not dare set the Queen down at any patrol station, but a company one, which would be manned by only 2 or 3 men and not expecting any but their own people. An IS owed them help now. "There may be trouble," he said, not that he would have any regrets if there were. If the Ices were responsible for the present plight of the Queen, he would welcome trouble, the kind which would plant his fists on some sneering icy face. "We'll see about that when we come to it," Rip went on to the control cabin with his figures. Carefully, he punched the combination on the plotter and watched it be prepared with the course Jellicoe had set before his collapse. "Good enough," he commented as the result flashed on. "We can make it without using too much fuel." "Make what?" That was Ali, up from the search of Costi's quarters. "Nothing," He gave his report of what he had found there and then returned to the earlier question. Make what? Swiftly, Dane outlined their suspicions. That the seat of the trouble lay in the Hydro and that they should clean out that section, drawing upon emergency materials at the IS Estat. Sounds all right. But you know what they do to pirates? Inquired the engineer apprentice. Space law came into Dane's field. He needed no prompting. Any ship in an emergency, he recited automatically, may claim supplies from the nearest Estat, paying for them when the voyage is completed. That means any patrol Estat. The companies are private property. But, Dane pointed out triumphantly, the law doesn't say so. There is nothing about any difference between company and patrol Estat in the law. He's right, Rip agreed. The law was framed when only the patrol had such stations. Companies put them in later to save tax. Remember? Legally, we're all right. Unless the agents on duty raise a howl, Ali amended. Oh, don't give me that look, Rip. I'm not sounding any worn-off on this, but I just want you to be prepared to find a cruiser riding our fins and giving us the hot flash as bandits. If you want to spoil the ices, I'm all for it. Got a stat of theirs pinpointed? Rip pointed to the figures on the computer. There she is. We can set down in about 5 hours ship time. How long will it take to strip the Hydro and reinstall? How can I tell? Ali sounded irritable. I can give you oxygen for quarters for about 2 hours. Depends upon how fast we can move. No telling until we make a start. He started for the corridor and then added over his shoulder, You'll have to answer a comm challenge. Thought about that? Why? Rip asked. It might be comm repairs bringing us in. They won't be expecting trouble and we will. We'll have the advantage. But Ali was not to be shaken out of his usual dim view of the future. All right. So we land, blaster in hand, and take the place, and they get off one little squeak to the patrol. Well, a short life, but an interesting one. And we'll make all the video channels for sure when we go out with rockets blasting. Nothing like having a little excitement to break the dull routine of a voyage. We aren't going to, are we? Dane protested. Land armed, I mean. Ali stared at him and Rip, to Dane's surprise, did not immediately repudiate that thought. The sleep rods, certainly, the astrogator apprentice said after a pause. We'll have to be prepared for the moment when they find out who we are, and you can't reset a Hydro in a few minutes, not when we have to keep oxygen on for the others. If we were able to turn that off and work in suits, it'd be a quicker job. We could dump before we set down and then pile it in at once, but this way it's going to be piecework, and it all depends on the agents of the stat whether we have trouble or not. We had better break out the suits now, Ali added to Rip's estimate of the situation. If we set down and pile out wearing suits at once, it will build up our tale of being poor wrecked spacemen. Sleep rods or not, Dane thought to himself, the whole plan was one born of desperation. It would depend upon who manned the Estat and how fast the free traders could move once the Queen touched her fins to Earth. Knock out their comms, that was Ali continuing to plan. Do that first, and then we don't have to worry about someone calling in the patrol. Rip stretched. For the first time in hours, he seemed to have returned to his usual placid self. Good thing somebody in this spacer watches video serials. Ali, you can brief us on all the latest tricks of space pirates. Nothing is so wildly improbable that you can't make use of it sometime during a checkered career. He glanced over the board before he brought his hand down on a single key set a distance apart from the other controls. Put some local color into it, was his comment. Dane understood. Rip had turned on the distress signal at the Queen's nose. When she set down in the stat field, she would be flaming a banner of trouble. Next to the wan deadlights, set only when a ship had no hope of ever reaching port at all, that signal was one every spacer dreaded having to flash. But it was not the deadlights, not yet for the Queen. Working together, they brought out the spacesuits and readied them at the hatch. Then, Weeks and Dane took up the task of tending their unconscious charges, while Rip and Ali prepared for landing. There was no change in the sleepers. In Angelico's cabin, even Queeks appeared to be influenced by the plight of its master, for, instead of greeting Dane with its normal aspect of rage, the Hoobat stayed quiescent on the floor of its cage, its top claws hooked about two of the wires, its protruding eyes staring out into the room with what seemed close to a malignant intelligence. It did not even spit as Dane passed under its abode to pour thin soup into his patient. As for Sinbad, the cat had retreated to Dane's cabin and steadily refused to leave the quarters he had chosen, resisting with tooth and claw the one time Dane had tried to take him back to Van Rieke's office in his own hammock there. Afterwards, the cargo apprentice did not try to evict him. There was comfort in seeing that plump gray body curled on the bunk he had little chance to use. His nursing duties performed for the moment, Dane ventured into the hydro. He was practiced in tending his vital heart of the ship's air supply, but outfitting a hydro was something else again. In his cadet years, he had aided in such a program at least twice as a matter of learning the basic training of the service, but then they had had unlimited supplies to draw on, and the action had taken place under no more pressure than that exerted by the instructors. Now it was going to be a far more tricky job. He went slowly down the aisle between banks of green things. Plants from all over the galaxy, grown for their contribution to the air renewal, as well as side products such as fresh fruit and vegetables, were banked there. The sweet odor of their verdant life was strong, but how could any of the four now on duty tell what was rightfully there and what might have been brought in? And could they be sure anything had been introduced? Dane stood there, his eyes searching those lines of greens, such a mixture of greens from the familiar shade of Terra's fields to greens tinged with shades first bestowed by other suns on other worlds, looking for one which was alien enough to be noticeable. Only Mura, who knew this garden as he knew his own cabin, could have differentiated between them. They would just dump everything and trust to luck. He was suddenly aware of a slight movement in the banks. A shivering of stem, quiver of leaf. The mere act of his passing had set some sensitive plant to register his presence. A lacy, fern-like thing was contracting its fronds into balls. He should not stay, disturbing the peace of the hydro, but it made little difference now. Within a matter of hours, all this luxuriance would be thrust out to die, and they would have to depend upon canned oxygen algae tanks. Too bad. The hydro represented much time and labor on Mura's part, and Tau had medical plants growing there he had been observing for a long time. As Dane closed the door behind him, seeing the line of bald fern which had marked his passage, he heard a faint rustling, a sound as if a wind had swept across the green room within. The imagination, which was a trader's asset when it was kept within bounds, suggested that the plants inside guessed, with a frown for his own sentimentality. Dane strode down the corridor and climbed to check with Rip and Control. The astrogator apprentice had his own problems. To bring the Queen down on the circumscribed field of an E-stat without a guide beam to ride in, since, if they contacted the stat, they must reveal their own comm was working and they would have to answer the questions, was the sort of test even a seasoned pilot would tense over. Yet Rip was sitting now in the captain's place, his broad hands spread out on the edge of the control board waiting, and below in the engine room Ali was in Stotts' place ready to fire and cut rockets at order. Of course they were both several years ahead of him in the service, Dane knew, but he wondered at their quick assumption of responsibility and whether he himself could ever reach that point of self-confidence, his memory turning to the bad mistake he had made on Sargol. There was the sharp note of a warning gong, the flash of red light on the control board. They were off automatic. From here on, it was all Kip's work. Dane strapped down at the silent comm unit and was startled a moment later when it spat words at him translated from space code. Identify, ISE stat calling spacer, identify. So compelling was that demand that Dane's fingers went to the answer key before he remembered and snatched them back, to fold his hands in his lap. Identify. The expressionless voice of the translator droned over their heads. Rip's hands were on the control board, playing the buttons there with the precision of a musician creating some symphonic masterpiece, and the Queen was alive, now quivering through her stout plates coming into a landing. Dane watched the visa plate. The E-stat asteroid was of a reasonable size, but in their eyes it was a bleak, torn mote of stuff swimming through vast emptiness. Identify, the drone heightened in pitch. Rip's lips were compressed. He made quick calculations, and Dane saw that though Jellicoe was the master, Rip was fully fit to follow in his captain's boot prints. There was sudden silence in the cabin. The demand had stopped. The agents below must now have realized that the ship with the distress signals blazing on her nose was not going to reply. Dane found he could not watch the visa plate now. Rip's hands about their task filled his whole range of sight. He knew that Shannon was using every bit of his skill and knowledge to jockey them into the position where they could ride their tail rockets down to the scorched rock of the Estat field. Perhaps it wasn't as smooth a landing as Jellicoe could have made, but they did it. Rip's hands were quiet. Again, that patch of darkness showed on the back of his tunic. He made no move from his seat. "Secure?" Ali's voice floated up to them. Dane unbuckled his safety webbing and got up, looked to Shannon for orders. This was Rip's plan they were to carry through. Then something moved him to give honor where it was due. He touched that bowed shoulder before him. "Fin landing, brother. 4 points and down." Rip glanced up. A grin made him look his old self. "Ought to have a recording of that for the board when I go up for my pass-through." Dane matched his smile. "Too bad we didn't have someone out there with a tri-D machine. More likely it'd be evidence at our trial for piracy." Their words must have reached Ali on the ship's intercom, for his deflating reply came back to remind them of why they had made that particular landing. "Do we move now?" "Check first," Rip said into the mic. Dane looked at the visa plate. Against a background of jagged rock teeth was the bubble of the Estat housing, more than 3/4 of it being in the hollowed-out sections below the surface of the miniature world which supported it, as Dane knew. But a beam of light shone from the dome to center on the grounded Queen. They had not caught the Stat agents napping. They made the rounds of the spacer, checking on each of the semi-conscious men. Ali had ready the artificial oxygen tanks. They must move fast once they began the actual task of clearing and restocking the hydro. "Hope you have a good story ready," he commented as the other three joined him by the hatch to don the suits, which would enable them to cross the airless, heatless surface of the asteroid. "We have a poison hydro," Dane said. "One look at the plants we dump will give you the lie. They won't accept our story without investigation." Dane was aroused. Did Ali think he was as stupid as all that? "If you'd take a look in there now, you'd believe me," he snapped. "What did you do?" Ali sounded genuinely interested. "Chucked a heated can of lake oil over a good section. It's wilting down fast in big patches." Rip snorted. "Good old lake oil. You drink it, you wash in it, and now you kill off the hydro with it. Maybe we can give the company an extra testimonial for the official jabber and collect when we hit Terra. All right. Weeks," he spoke to the little man, "you listen in on the comm. It's tuned to our helmet units. We'll climb into these pipe suits and see how many tears we can wring out of the ices with our sad, sad tail." They got into the awkward, bulky suits and squeezed into the hatch while Weeks slammed the locked door at their backs and operated the outer opening. Then they were looking out across the ground, still showing signs of the heat of their landing and lighted by the dome beam. "Nobody hurrying out with an aid and comfort kit," Rip's voice sounded in Dane's earphones. "Little slack, aren't they?" Slack? Or was it that the Ices had recognized the Queen and was preparing the sort of welcome the remnant of her crew could not withstand? Dane, wanting very much in his heart to be elsewhere, climbed down the ladder in Rip's wake, both of them spotlighted by the immovable beam from the Stat Dome. And that is where we will leave off for today. So we will pick up with Chapter 11 on Sunday, Desperate Measures. I hope you've enjoyed sitting and listening today while we've read these chapters of Plague Ship, and I hope you'll join me Thursday. I hope you have a good night and a good rest of your week.